The snow fell in soft, soundless sheets, blanketing the dark pines in ghostly white. Somewhere, far off, a wolf's mournful howl drifted through the frozen air, echoing between tree trunks, so ancient they seemed like pillars holding up the sky. Near the edge of this vast forest, a small fire flickered, the only sign of warmth in a world made of ice and shadows. Around this fire crouched 6 men, their cloaks pulled tight against the cold. Beneath the furs and rough-spun wool, each was armed. Iron swords lay at their feet, axes propped near frozen boots, round shields half buried in drifts. These were Norsemen Vikings, men whose names struck fear from Lindisfarne to Constantinople. But tonight, fear belonged to them. One of them, old enough for silver to streak his beard, young enough still to wield a blade, leaned closer to the flames. His name was Erling Skull-Splitter, a name earned not in jest but in blood. In his youth, he had led raids down the Irish coast, his longship's prow slicing through foam like a shark's fin. He had taken gold from Frankish monasteries, silver from Saxon villages. He had stood at the prow of his ship in storms that would drown lesser men. Yet here, on the edge of the White Forest, the Norse called Biamians, Erling's eyes darted into the trees as though they hid 1,000 watchful spirits. His fingers drummed the hilt of his sword, not out of readiness, but of restlessness, of dread he could not name. Beside him sat his youngest Thorsten, barely 17 winters old, his cheeks still raw with the first hint of a beard. Thorsten's gaze was fixed on the forest too, his blue eyes wide and unblinking. In his hands he turned over a rune stone, etched with a single warding symbol. It had been pressed into his palm by an old woman before they left the coastal village 2 days ago, a Sami trader's widow who whispered that the forest was no place for the likes of them. They had laughed at her then, but they did not laugh now. Closer to the flames, one of the men stirred a blackened iron pot that hung over the fire. Inside, a weak broth, fish bones, and dried seaweed, no game to be found, though they had hunted since dawn. The forest was empty of life, or so it seemed, yet they all felt it, the sense that eyes watched from every snow-laden bough. A hush fell over the small company as Erling spoke, his voice low, cracked like a frozen branch. I remember my father telling of this place. He said, the trees here can swallow a man's footprints. Said, the folk who live here wear the snow like a cloak, see without being seen. He spat into the snow, but his eyes never left the darkness beyond the fire's flicker. Thorsten swallowed hard. Are they just men, father? These, Biamians? At the name Biamians, 2 of the older warriors shifted uncomfortably, crossing themselves with stiff, gloved hands. One, Harold Redtooth, a man who had gutted monks with his bare blade, muttered into his beard, not men as we know men. A log cracked in the fire, a loud, sudden pop, like a branch snapping in the woods, and every head turned sharply. For a heartbeat, silence pressed on their ears so heavily they thought they could hear their own blood. A gust of wind sifted through the camp, making the fire dance and hiss. In that moment, the forest seemed to lean closer, the shadows between the trunks shifting, alive. Erling forced a laugh, brittle, hollow. Superstitions, fishermen's tales. If they were so mighty, where are their fortresses, their fleets? Ha! We are Norsemen, we are the fear. Yet, even as he spoke, he could not quite believe his own words. Somewhere in the drifts behind them, a thin sound like the crunch of snow under a soft, padded boot made Thorsten flinch. Harold Redtooth rose, axe in hand, peering into the gloom. Nothing there. Nothing but pines and drifting snow. Another man, Bjark the Bold, leaned closer to the flame, voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. My uncle came this way 20 winters back, traded seal fur with them, came home with stories, said they move on snow as we move on ships, said they speak to the forest spirits, wear skins white as the moon, slip between trees like mist. He said he watched them hunt, their arrows never miss, never. You won't see them until the blood hits your throat. Torsten's eyes flickered to his father. Erling said nothing. He only stared at the line of black trees, their branches heavy with snow that glowed pale in the moonlight. In that silence, an old memory surfaced. His father, stooped with age, whispering by the hearth. Beware the watchers in the white forest. They see without being seen. They kill without warning. A story for children, Erling had thought then. A tale to keep young raiders from wandering too far north. But here now the tale felt close, cold, and real. Suddenly, from the trees, an owl called a single, sharp screech that made Torsten drop the runestone into the snow. He scrambled to pick it up, his breath steaming in frantic puffs. Erling laid a hand on his son's shoulder, but said nothing. What comfort could he offer when his own heart thudded against his ribs like a drum? Above them, the aurora flickered into life, green and white flames rippling across the vast sky, dancing in silence over a frozen land. The men stared upward, the cold forgotten for a moment. In Norse belief, the lights were Valkyries riding to gather the souls of the slain. Here, beneath the Watcher's forest, it seemed the Valkyries might not have far to fly. The owl called again closer this time. The men shifted, eyes scanning the tree line, hands tightening on hafts and hilts. The fire hissed low, casting their shadows long and monstrous on the snow. In that flickering light, a thought slithered through each mind. Who hunts the hunters when the forest itself wears a mask? Who strikes fear into the hearts of those who had never known it before? The Norse were used to being the nightmare, but tonight they were the prey. And in the endless silence of the white forest, something watched, something waited. Something ancient, patient, and utterly unafraid of wolves dressed as men. Long before the northern forests swallowed their courage, before strange runes whispered warnings from stone, the Vikings were the undisputed predators of the known world's sea-born wolves, whose prows cut through rivers and seas alike, spreading fear and fire wherever they came ashore. It began with ships, not just any vessels, but marvels of cunning design and hard-earned craft. Along the fjords of Norway, the flat coasts of Denmark, and the rocky inlets of Sweden, master shipwrights bent stubborn oak and pine into forms that seemed born for water. Long and lean, with shallow drafts and overlapping planks that flexed with the waves, these ships langskip. Longships made the Norse the greatest sailors of the early medieval world. At dawn, you could stand on a headland overlooking the grey North Sea and watch them appear dragon-headed prows rising out of the mist like creatures from a myth. 60 warriors could sit shoulder to shoulder on rough benches, oars pulling in perfect rhythm, the hull slicing through iron-cold water faster than any merchant cog or fishing coracle. When the wind favoured them, a square sail dyed red, or striped with bold patterns to strike terror at distance, would billow out, pushing the ship onward as easily up rivers as across open sea. The longship was not merely transport, it was the Vikings' secret weapon. Where the sea ended, the rivers began silver arteries, winding deep into the heart of kingdoms, thought safe from raiders. Frankish monasteries, Saxon villages, Slavic trading posts all fell within reach of these shallow-drafted beasts. The prow could slide onto any beach, The crew leap out, raid, burn, vanish. By the time local levies gathered, the sea wolves were gone, slipping downriver with gold, cattle, or thralls. In these ships, the Norse crossed to the green coasts of Ireland, the rocky isles of Scotland, the soft river mouths of Francia and England. In them, they braved the North Atlantic swells to find Iceland's volcanic shores, Greenland's icy fjords, even the wooded edge of Vinland, North America, 5 centuries before Columbus's sails ever stirred the same wind. Their weapons were as harsh and honest as the seas they sailed. Round shields of painted planks, edged with iron. Axes, from small bearded tools to massive 2-handed splitters capable of cleaving helmets and the skulls within. Spears, the weapon of Odin himself, thrown from ships to strike terror before a single foot hit land. And the sword, the pride of any Norse warrior who could afford it, a long iron blade, pattern, welded with twisting lines that caught the light like ripples on black water. A good sword was a kingly thing, costly, prized, handed down through generations. Their enemies called them devils. The monks at Lindisfarne, where the first blow of the Viking Age fell in 793 CE, wrote of heathen men descending like a storm. They shattered altars, stole holy relics, put iron through the soft bellies of unarmed brothers. But it was not just slaughter for slaughter's sake. Behind the axe blows lay hunger, ambition, and a growing hunger for silver that drove men to risk foreign shores. A Viking raid was brutal, yes, but it was also precise. Word would come by whispers that a coastal monastery held gold chalices, jewelled reliquaries, livestock fattened on church lands. By dawn, the longships would be drawn up on the sand, the warriors disembarking in a disciplined rush, shields locked in a tight wall, axes and swords ready. The resistance, if any, was often unprepared monks who had never needed swords, local farmers who had never seen steel wielded so expertly. In minutes treasure was claimed, captives rounded up, buildings put to the torch. By dusk the raiders were gone, the smoke left behind as a sign that nowhere was safe from the sea wolves. Yet the Vikings were more than raiders. Their ferocity bought them infamy, but it was trade that bought them true wealth and roots that ran deeper than any battlefield glory. After the ships beached and the first plunder was spent, there was always barter. Furs from the Arctic, walrus ivory, iron, and soapstone from Scandinavia's rugged interior, fine swords forged in secret fjord forges. They brought amber beads, honey, reindeer hides, traded them for silver dirhams from Arab lands, silks from the east, spices carried by Byzantine merchants. In Dublin, York, Novgorod Viking settlements grew from rough encampments to bustling towns, marketplaces humming with many tongues. Some warriors who had once swung axes for gold found wealth in scales and weights instead, weighing silver coins and furs on wooden counters beneath turf-roofed halls. Others became kings of islands in the Orkneys, the Shetlands, the Hebrides, small kingdoms afloat on tides and ruled by men whose grandfathers had come only to raid. They were farmers too. Not all the Norse went a Viking. Behind every sleek ship was a longhouse of tilled soil and livestock. The same men who felled English monks would, come spring, guide a plough behind a shaggy ox, seed barley into stubborn earth, fish rivers swollen with spring melt, men's sails by hearthlight as their wives spun wool and told tales of Odin's wolves and Freya's tears. Honour bound them, too, an honour steeped in blood and the old sagas. To die sword in hand was to find a place in Valhalla. To show cowardice was a stain that would follow a man's kin long after he was ash. Young boys learned the sword as soon as they could lift it. Fathers passed down not just blades, but stories of raids, conquests, and the gods who watched from high Asgard, waiting for the bravest warriors to feast beside them at the end of days. By the 9th century, the Norse tide had reached every shore that could be reached from the green isles of Ireland to the rich river cities of Kievan Rus. They had bent the sea to their will, made kings pay tribute, turned the fear in others' hearts into silver in their own. So complete was their mastery that the word Viking itself did not mean people, it meant the act of raiding, of going out to plunder. And yet in all their triumph, there were lands they could not bend, places the prow could not pierce. Beyond the grey fjords, beyond the birch woods and open seas, lay a frontier so hostile it turned the predator into prey. It was here, in the land called Biamians, the white forests and frozen marshes of the far north, that the Vikings learned that even the fiercest hunters can be out-hunted. For beyond the edge of their maps, in the realm where the sun barely rose, and snow whispered secrets to the pines, the sea-wolves met shadows that would not be driven back by steel alone. To a Viking, the world was not a flat map laid smooth under their feet. It was a living beast of coasts, fjords, rivers, and storms. Where their ships could glide, the Norse felt at home. But beyond the fjords and the timbered valleys of their homelands stretched a realm that even the boldest longship could not easily claim, a realm they called Biamians. North of the northernmost farms, past the last fish-filled fjord and the farthest reindeer herds, the world hardened into deep pine forests, endless snowfields, and marshes that froze under a sky that sometimes forgot the sun entirely. This was no man's land, or so the Vikings had believed. Yet within its shifting silence lived a people older than any saga could trace, men and women, as much a part of the land as the wolves that howled through the night. In the sagas they were shadows the watchers, the white ones rarely named outright, for to speak of them too boldly was to invite misfortune. The Norse called them Biamians, after the lands they roamed, a name carved into runestones like a ward against the unknown. A place half real, half dream, the edge where the solid world crumbled into superstition. No map could fix the borders of Biamians. To the west, its forests touched the frozen spines of what we now call northern Norway and Finland. To the east, it merged with the endless taiga stretching toward the White Sea and the bone-cold reaches of what would one day be Russia's Arctic crown. To the Vikings, whose settlements clung to more forgiving coasts, this was a land that swallowed armies, silenced axes, and buried iron beneath drifts so deep they seemed bottomless. In the mead halls of Uppsala or Trondheim, warriors would boast of raids on Frankish monasteries or Irish ports, but when the talk turned to the far north, voices dropped. The young mocked the stories until they grew old enough to know that some fears can stalk you even in your sleep. For in this place, the longship's prow was worthless, rivers froze, solid, or vanished under snow. The thick forests tangled and closed around men unfamiliar with their ways. To hunt here was not like hunting deer in the southern birch woods. The snow swallowed sound, the cold stole your warmth as quick as any blade. The land itself seemed to rise against intruders, stripping them of fire, of food, of direction. Yet the Biamians called this realm home. They did not build great longhouses, nor carve dragon prows. Their wealth was not gold and silver, but silence and secrecy. They moved on snow the way the Norse moved on water, with ease, confidence, and a mastery bred over centuries. Their knowledge was not written, but woven into every fur hood, every hide snowshoe, every carved sled pulled by reindeer across the white emptiness. When the Vikings first pressed into these forests, they came not as conquerors, but as traders drawn by whispers of furs thick as wolf pelts and ivory carved from walrus and narwhal tusks. To a Norse chieftain, these goods were worth more than stolen gold. They were the currency of prestige, traded southward for Frankish blades, Arab silver, silk from lands so far that no fjord ever touched them. So the first steps into Biamians were cautious, a few men at a time, leading ponies laden with beads, iron knives, salt offerings for barter. Sometimes the exchange was fair. The Biamians emerged from the tree-line-like spirits, clothed in white reindeer hides, accepting trinkets for bundles of fur that would warm the halls of kings. Then they would vanish again, melting back into the snow, as if the land itself had swallowed them. But caution is not a Viking virtue. As the tales of fur wealth grew richer, the raids began small bands at first, thinking to take by axe what they might otherwise trade for. But what fortress could they sack? What village could they plunder? The Biamians had neither. They had the forest a fortress, with no gates to breach, no walls to batter. One winter, a petty king's son named Eric Frostblood led 50 men into Biamians. They boasted that they would return with sleds piled high, that the people of the White Forests would bow before Norse iron. Weeks passed, the fjord folk waited, then months. Of Eric's men, only 3 stumbled back. They spoke of eyes in the snow, of sentries who vanished in the night, of traps that turned icy clearings into pits bristling with sharpened stakes. They spoke of arrows that hissed from nowhere, finding the gaps between ringmail and fur, of nights so cold that even their hearth fires could not bite back the frost that crept into bones. Some whispered that the forest itself moved to bury them, drifts growing higher in the dark, tracks erased before dawn. They spoke of strange songs that drifted between the pines, low and wordless, winding through the darkness like the howl of wolves that never showed themselves. After Eric's ill-fated march, wiser Norse leaders turned again to trade, but even the trade routes were not safe. Bands that grew too bold found their guards gone at dawn, throats cut while the snow hid every sign. A single arrow stuck in a tree above a campfire would send a band scurrying back south. Over time, the Vikings learned to respect this invisible border. In their minds, the world had edges that were real coasts that could be crossed in ships, rivers that could be sailed. But the white forests of Biamians were an edge of another kind, an edge of the known world where courage met something colder than fear, futility. Even the fiercest shield wall could not hold against an enemy who refused to be seen. Even the mightiest axe could not cut down snow or silence. In Biamians, the Norse found a limit to their mastery, a lesson whispered by the pines and carved in runes half buried in the frost. Beware the watchers in the white forest. They see without being seen. They kill without warning. In the far north, where the world becomes a realm of frost and whispering forests, the Biamians thrived like shadows made flesh, a people so deeply entangled with their land that even the Vikings, masters of the coasts and rivers, could scarcely comprehend them. No stone fortresses rose in Biamians, no halls of carved beams echoed with the clang of boasting warriors. Instead, there were hidden winter lodges, half buried under drifts, smoke rising so thin and low that a Viking scout might pass within bowshot and never notice. There were lean-tos and conical huts of reindeer hide, erected and struck in a single night, leaving barely a trace in the snow once gone. Their homes moved with the seasons, as fluid as the snow that blanketed the forest floor. Who, then, were these people who turned the Norse nightmares against them? The Biamians were not a single tribe, in the sense the Norse knew not a kingdom ruled by a Jarl's line. nor a clan that built its strength behind high palisades. They were a weave of families and bands kin to the ancient Sami and other Finno-Ugric forest dwellers, living by rhythms that made sense only when you learned to listen to the pines and the reindeer trails. They were reindeer herders and hunters, traders and trappers, spirit talkers and snow walkers. A Biamian child learned to ski before he could read tracks in the soft undergrowth. A daughter learned the art of the hide, how to cure it, so it shed snow, how to stitch boots, so light they seemed spun from the air itself. And all learned to see the forest not as wilderness, but as a living companion, one that gave, sheltered, and sometimes hid them completely from the eyes of intruders. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of Norse society, kings, jarls, bondi, thralls, the Biamians held to a different measure of worth. Status came not by birth but by proof. The skill of the hunter who could track elk through a blizzard for days without leaving a single sign. The wisdom of the elder who read the patterns of stars and ice to find safe passage. The knowledge of the healer who knew which lichen could close a wound that would kill another man in days. In the Norse imagination, these folk became spirits themselves too wild to be tamed, too rooted in the cold, to be forced under sword point. Norse traders who returned south spoke of their encounters in half-awed, half-frightened whispers. One tale told of a Biamian elder, clad in a white wolfskin cloak, who could sit for hours in the open snow without a fire, listening to the wind as if it carried voices only he could hear. Another spoke of children who could vanish into the trees at the crack of a branch, leaving behind nothing but a swirl of flakes where they had stood. Some swore they could speak with wolves, or change shape under the moon's pale eye. Superstition, perhaps. But for Norsemen, who prided themselves on seeing the world in the bright, hard light of steel and honour, these stories pressed into deeper fears. In the warm halls of the south, spirits were things of firelight and carved runes bound by ritual, named by the skalds. But in Biamiand, the forest itself became spirit, its people, its eyes and hands. Archaeologists digging beneath the permafrost centuries later would find the faintest traces of their world shards, of bone needles, stone scrapers, bronze ornaments traded up from the south, worn smooth by years of use. They would find ski fragments older than any Norse longship plank, proof that when Vikings pushed north on foot, they were already at a disadvantage. But more than tools and hides, it was knowledge that set the Biamians apart. They knew how to trap marten and fox in winter's deepest cold, how to read the sign of snowdrifts like pages in a book. They understood how to move over frozen lakes, so thin they would crack under a man in iron mail, but hold a gliding sled, drawn by reindeer or dog, weight spread over ice as fragile as glass. This knowledge was guarded, taught only by practice, handed from elder to child, like an heirloom blade. Stories were woven into chants, songs carried through generations that told not only of spirits, but of safe crossings, good hunting places, the signs of storms that could kill whole camps before dawn. The Norse, for all their sagas, never truly cracked these songs. They brought blades to conquer, but here, blades meant little. To kill a Biamian's reindeer herd in the snow was to find yourself starving as well, the forest sealing itself behind you. To catch them in battle was to find only empty camps and distant footfalls, then silence. For the Biamians, war was not a test of open courage. It was patience made deadly. They struck when they wished, where they wished then vanished again, their tracks swept clean by drifting powder. Some Viking warriors returned south, claiming they had seen no one at all, only strange marks on tree trunks, a flicker of white fur in a blizzard, the low hoot of an owl that made strong men grip their spear shafts tighter. These glimpses only fed the legend that the Biamians were more spirit than flesh, half human, half ghost. Ghosts in the pines, wearing the land like a second skin. And so they remained, a people who made the world's coldest forests, their fortress one without walls, yet stronger than any Norse shield wall ever forged. To the Viking mind, the forest was a place to pass through, to hunt within, perhaps to gather timber for ships or firewood for the hearth. It was not a weapon. Weapons were iron-forged and grasped in calloused hands, swords that split mail, axes that felled men and trees alike. But the Biamians knew another truth. In the frozen north, the land itself was the first and deadliest blade. The Vikings came from rugged coasts and rocky fields. Yes, they knew wind that could tear a sail and seas that could break a ship in two. But on land they found the measure of the world by sight and sound, a coastline, a clearing, a river to guide them. In Biamian, such certainty vanished the moment a man left the warmth of his fire. The forest closed in tight and deep. Ancient trunks locked shoulder to shoulder like silent sentinels. Underfoot, the snow was no mere blanket, it was a shifting labyrinth that swallowed tracks in minutes, masking pits and creeks, hiding hazards beneath a soft white skin that seemed harmless until it gave way under boot or hoof. To the untrained, the snow was treacherous. To the Biamians, it was a living ally. In the depths of winter, the sun might slip above the horizon for mere hours, its pale glow no match for the endless twilight under the trees. The wind knifed through layers of wool and fur, numbing fingers, stiffening sword grips, until a warrior's own mail felt like ice clinging to his shoulders. Fires sputtered and died in drifts, smoke rising, only to vanish among the branches, where no man could see it from afar. Yet the Biamians did not huddle by hearth fires as the Norse did. They moved when the snow moved, gliding across crusted drifts on broad wooden skis, waxed with animal fat. They wore snowshoes woven of birch and reindeer sinew-wide, light, spreading their weight so they might drift where the Norse would sink waist-deep. An Arab trader who ventured north with a Norse band in the early 10th century recorded his astonishment at the Biamians' winter mastery. They travel upon the snow as we travel upon water, swift and without sign, leaving neither trail nor sound but the hiss of wind. In these forests, a Viking's iron was often more curse than blessing. Armour weighed a man down, made him sweat and freeze in turn. Chainmail rattled, giving away a position long before the man within saw his enemy. Heavy boots broke through snow crust, sinking him deeper while his quarry ghosted past on silent runners. The Biamians used this knowledge not to face the Vikings in open battle that would have been foolish. Instead, they turned the cold and dark into the perfect ambush. A Norse warband might push into the forest for days, following tracks that twisted between ancient firs. At night, they would camp near a creek or clearing, huddled around sputtering coals, shivering beneath fur cloaks heavy with frost. And then a flicker, a whisper, a distant crack in the underbrush that could have been a deer or not. A sentry vanishes into the dark with only a muffled gasp. When dawn comes, the snow is stained pink. The sentry's place, marked only by a single, clean cut and strange signs carved into bark above the trail. In such moments, the Vikings found themselves in a nightmare they could not charge or cleave. Their shield wall was useless here. There was no clash of blades, no clash at all, only a creeping dread that spread like frostbite. As one Norse skald later wrote of a failed raid into the White Forest, "We marched as wolves, but found the land a maw that swallowed us whole, one by one, in silence." It was not merely stealth that made the land so lethal. It was the traps, simple yet deadly, hidden pitfall snares, lined with sharpened stakes, covered by a skin of snow. Deadfall logs rigged to fall when a branch was cut. Thin ice trails, marked with faint signs. Only the Biamians could read ice that would hold a man on skis, but crack beneath iron boots and armoured shoulders. The forest itself became a labyrinth. Biamians carved secret paths over generations, narrow corridors through dense trees marked by subtle signs. A strip of bark peeled from a birch, a carved spiral hidden beneath lichen. A Viking, lost in these woods, found himself circling back, walking past the same tree until hunger gnawed and panic grew louder than his battle songs. Even the weather obeyed the Biamians. When storms rose, as they always did, they moved ahead of the winds, setting traps in passes where drifting snow buried their sign within hours. Norsemen who sought shelter often found it too late, snow piling high against low campfires, burying tents and half-buried longboats alike. Yet the greatest weapon was not snow, nor cold, nor hidden pit, it was the mind. The Biamians knew that fear is a frost that creeps under mail and into the marrow of men who pride themselves on fearlessness. Each night the forest grew thicker, each owl's hoot or wolf's cry, a reminder that something unseen moved just beyond the circle of the Norse campfire's light. Sometimes they left signs behind, bones arranged in strange patterns, runes carved into trees in symbols. The Norse half recognized but could not read. Messages half remembered from old tales, wards or warnings or curses. It hardly mattered which, when a man was alone and the wind moaned through the trees like the voice of dead men. The Vikings, who had shattered the walls of monasteries, broken kingships along the coasts of Europe, found themselves undone by drifts and shadows. No iron edge could split the snow apart. No battle cry could silence the creak of frozen boughs overhead. In Biamians, the very land turned hunter, and every snowflake that drifted silently down was a blade, unsheathed, not in iron, but in cold, wielded by the ghost people who knew every route and hidden path. This was the true genius of the Biamians. They needed no fortress of stone, because they had built a fortress of silence and frost. Deep within the white forest, where the world muffled itself under endless drifts of snow, the Vikings found themselves haunted, not by warriors they could face, but by something altogether stranger watchers they could not see, hear, or strike down. The Norse called them many names: Skugfolk, shadow people; Witvandra, white wanderers, but in half-whispered tales around the fire, they were simply the Watchers. The word Biamians named a people. Watchers named what they did and what the Norse feared most, that they saw everything and left nothing to chance. It began with signs, small things at first, enough to gnaw at the edge of a warrior's certainty. A lone birch, stripped of bark in a pattern that matched no Norse rune, but looked eerily deliberate. A ring of stones found where no camp had ever been made, encircling the burnt-out remnants of an old fire, yet still warm to the touch. Sometimes, at the edge of the camp, a man might see footprints single, narrow tracks that approached, but never retreated, as if the forest itself had reached out to press a question into the snow. Veteran Norse warriors who had seen 100 battles began to mutter charms under their breath. They tied scraps of iron and bone into their beards, wards against spirits, just as their grandfathers had done in an older, more pagan age. These were not men prone to fear. They had stood in shield walls against Saxon kings and Frankish knights, stormed the stone ramparts of Irish forts, and come away with heads on their spear tips and silver in their longships' holds. But here, in Biamians, iron did not bite ghosts, and ghosts, it seemed, were everywhere. A runestone unearthed centuries later near Trondheim bears one of the oldest references to the Watchers. Beware the eyes in the white forest they see without being seen, strike without blade or flame. This stone, half buried beneath pine roots, was carved with runes so faint they might have been overlooked altogether, if not for a sharp-eyed farmer digging a new well. Scholars still argue whether it was meant as a grave marker or a warning. To the Norse who carved it, the distinction may not have mattered. By day, the forest felt vast and empty. Yet at night, the sense of being watched pressed down like new-fallen snow, weightless yet suffocating. Fires were banked low to keep shadows from dancing too far into the trees. Sentries were doubled, then tripled. Yet the tales tell that for every 2 eyes the Norse turned outward, 10 unseen eyes watched them back. The Biamians learned early that their true strength lay not in meeting iron with iron, but in letting fear bloom like frost inside the Norsemen's hearts. They moved at the forest's edge, not so much hidden as part of the land itself. Their white furs turned them into drifting shapes, half glimpsed through falling snow. A warrior might swear he saw movement a flicker of pale against the trunks, only to blink and find nothing there but wind in the branches. To understand the power of the Watchers, one must understand the silence. In the heart of the white forest, the silence was not mere absence of sound, it was a presence in itself. Snow absorbed the crunch of boots, swallowed the snap of twigs. Voices fell flat against pine trunks that seemed to lean closer the deeper a man went. Biamians made that silence an ally. Their winter moccasins were sewn from reindeer hide, padded with moss to dampen footfall. Their breath masked by fur hoods that drew steam sideways and downward, leaving no visible plume to betray them. In hunting bands, they moved like drifting mist pairs, or trios, fanning wide, communicating not with speech, but with signs. A flick of the hand, a nod, the soft touch of a snow-bent branch. More unsettling than the ambushes were the times the Watchers chose not to strike. A Norse patrol might wake to find strange symbols arranged at the camp's edge. Twigs laid out in spirals, animal bones threaded with strands of hair. Harmless perhaps, but their meaning ran deeper than any wound, a message clear in any tongue. We were here, we see you, sleep lightly. These were not men who raided for gold. They had no hoards hidden under sodden earth, no banners to fly, no gods who demanded piles of plundered silver. They had only the land and the certainty that they would remain, long after the Norse and their iron prows had rusted to nothing. Stories carried back to the fjords turned the Watchers into something more than human. Sagas told of Biamian hunters who could change form under the aurora's dancing lights, men who became wolves or owls or moved through snow like drifting spirits. Such tales were not idle fear, they were how the Norse mind made sense of the inexplicable. When no blood trail could be found after an arrow struck, when footprints vanished mid-step across a frozen lake, it was easier to whisper shapeshifter than to admit that the forest's mastery lay beyond even a raider's cunning. One winter, a Norse band led by Ivar Longtooth set up camp near a frozen river deep within Biamian. They built a palisade of fresh-cut logs, confident that their iron axes and thick shields would guard them from any living foe. On the second night, sentries heard what they swore was the hoot of an owl, repeated 3 times, then silence. In the morning, the sentries were gone. Their boots stood upright in the snow, empty as husks, no tracks leading away. Within days, Ivar's men abandoned the camp, leaving behind provisions and loot taken in earlier raids, too fearful to risk another night under the Watchers' patient eyes. Even the old gods seemed to hold their breath in Biamian. The runes that had guided Norsemen for centuries offered no comfort here. Thor's hammer might break stone walls and smash Saxon helms, but the forest's silence could not be struck down with Mjolnir. Odin's ravens could fly over seas and battlefields, but in this white maze they perched in the branches and said nothing. And so the watchers endured unseen, unsung in their own tongue, but immortal in the tales of the men who came south, and could not forget what they had felt in the endless night. Warriors who had faced Irish kings and Frankish counts might flinch at the crack of a branch, haunted not by what they had conquered, but by what had stared back at them through the drifting snow and chosen to let them live. In the warm mead halls of the south, a man's worth was counted in plunder and praise. In the fjord settlements, where Viking longhouses smoked under snow-heavy roofs, a warrior's deeds were sung aloud, so they would outlive his bones. To the Norse mind, glory was iron ringing on iron, enemies laid low where all could see. But in the frozen realm of the Biamians, worth was something else, entirely not what was shouted, but what was hidden. Elusiveness was not simply a tactic. It was the beating heart of Biamian life. In the white forests, to be seen was to risk death by hunger, by predator, by the edge of an axe from the south. To be invisible was survival, woven into every layer of daily existence. A Biamian child learned this before he learned to speak. When the first snows came, mothers showed daughters how to step lightly over drifts, how to wrap fur around their boots so no crunch betrayed their passing. Fathers taught sons to read the lay of the land by silence alone, the way wind moved through pine needles, the hush of snow falling off a branch. These were lessons as vital as any blade. The people themselves left so few marks that, centuries later, scholars would comb the taiga for signs they had ever existed at all. A stray stone hearth, the faint remains of a seasonal camp, ringed by fire-scorched pits where saplings had once bent to hold hides. No sprawling burial mounds like the Norse, no ship graves lined with swords and glittering hoards. The Biamians left the forest, mostly as they found it a pact of respect and secrecy between people and land. This culture of vanishing shaped every part of their daily life. Shelters were designed not to stand out, but to melt into the landscape. A winter lodge might be half sunk into the earth, covered with sod and drifted snow, until it looked like just another rise in the white. Smoke was vented sideways, through buried channels, rising far from where the people slept. From a distance, a hunter's camp might be nothing more than a ripple in the snow, a faint curl of steam blending with the frost-misted air. Their tools, too, spoke of this quiet cunning. Sleds built of light birch and lashed with reindeer hide were so silent that a full load of furs could glide across a frozen lake with no sound but the faint hiss of runners on ice. Bows were short and strong, crafted for manoeuvring through tight trees rather than open battlefields. The arrows they loosed flew low and fast, tipped with bone or iron barbs, designed not for showy wounds, but for silent kills, an elk, a wolf, or an unguarded man at the edge of a Viking patrol. Unlike the Norse, who marked shields and ships with bold runes and snarling dragons to declare their might, the Biamians marked their world with signs that could only be read by kin. A branch bent at an unnatural angle might mean a trap ahead or a warning that watchers were near. A knot of birch twigs tied with a single strand of reindeer hair hung at a crossing of game trails could signal which way the herd had moved or which path a trader should take to avoid strangers. It was said among the Norse that the Biamians had no kings. This was only half true. They had leaders, but these were not men who ruled by bloodline or hoarded gold rings on thick arms. Instead, power flowed to those who could disappear best, the elder who knew the safe winter routes, the hunter who could stalk a wolf for 3 days and return with meat when others starved, the quiet shaman who spoke to the forest as if it listened. Some among them were more than hunters. They were called, in whispers, the snowborn families who passed down the most secret arts of staying unseen. These were not warriors. In the Norse sense, they owned no mail, bore no heavy swords. Instead, they trained in moving across the deep drifts without leaving a single depression. They crafted footwear from white fox fur and birch bark soles, so light they floated atop fresh snow like drifting leaves. When a boy was chosen to walk the snowborn path, he was not given a blade first, he was given silence. His first trial was not to strike down an enemy, but to learn to pass a sleeping wolf without waking it. He learned to bury himself beneath snow and wait out a day without a single shiver betraying his breath. Only then would he be trusted with a curved blade, not a war axe, but a thin, wicked knife, meant for close work, a sentry's throat, a binding rope, a quiet message left in crimson on the white. Their raids were not raids in the Viking sense. No thunder of boots, no clash of shield and sword. Instead, they unravelled their enemy thread by thread. A patrol leader would vanish in the night, his men waking to find his place cold and empty. A supply cache buried by the Norse for the return march would be gone when they came back, the tracks that led to it erased by fresh snow, carefully brushed by a branch. A river crossing the Norse depended on would be rendered impassable when the Biamians cut a channel under the ice, turning it into a hidden trap. Sometimes they did nothing at all, and that was worst of all. For the waiting, the not knowing, gnawed at a man's mind more surely than hunger or frostbite. Hardened raiders began to hear voices in the wind, to flinch at the hoot of an owl, to imagine white shapes moving between the trunks when the snow came down thick. The strongest Viking armour could not guard a man's thoughts against the constant sense of being seen by eyes that never blinked. Back in their lodges, the Biamians spoke little of these things. They did not brag over the men they had felled, nor carve their deeds into stone to survive the centuries. Instead, they spoke softly over the fire's coals, passing stories to the next hunters, how to follow an elk across a frozen marsh without being seen by the beast or by the men who might follow the hunter home. A culture built on elusiveness left little behind for historians to find, but it left an impression so deep on Viking memory that their skalds spoke of it long after the last watcher's tracks faded. A people who taught the conquerors that not all battles are fought with blade against blade, and that sometimes to be unseen is the deadliest power of all. If a Viking raider prided himself on iron, the bright ring of sword and axe, the battered boss of a painted shield, then the Biamians trusted in something quieter, weapons designed not to clash but to cut, not to impress, but to vanish into the dark before a victim ever raised a cry. The watchers of the White Forest did not carry heavy axes, forged for splitting helm and bone in a roar of battle. They needed no round shields painted with snarling beasts, no mail shirts that clinked with every footstep through the brush. Their arsenal was the forest itself, and the tools they carried were extensions of its silence. The most feared of these was the bow. The Norse used bows, 2 stout ash staves, simple and powerful for hunting deer or launching volleys in a skirmish. But their bows were tools of daylight, of open fights. The Biamian bow was different, shorter, more supple, crafted from layered birch and sinew, curved to move easily through dense pine stands. Its string, twisted from reindeer gut, was strong but soft when loosed. It made no loud snap, just a muted twang, lost in the whisper of the trees. Their arrows were works of patience and necessity, shafts of willow or mountain ash, fletched with feathers so finely bound They did not flutter, but cut straight through air, as cold and thin as steel. Some tips were barbed bone, others shaped from iron, scavenged or traded from Norse settlements at the forest's edge. These points were not designed to smash through mail, but to slip between a gap in a collar, a slice of exposed flesh where cloak met throat. In close quarters, one well-placed arrow did what 10 war cries could not. Yet the bow was only the beginning. The Biamians carried knives so slender they could slip between vertebrae with a single practiced thrust. The blades were forged in cold forges, quenched in snowmelt thin as a finger, curved like a hawk's talon. Some were worn on the belt, others tucked in wrist sheaths or sewn into fur sleeves, easy to draw in a heartbeat when a sentry turned away. They favoured spears too, but not the broad-headed spears of Viking lines that clashed shield to shield. Biamian spears were light, whittled to a needlepoint, balanced for throwing or for a precise thrust in tight quarters. A man could carry 2 or 3 strapped across his back, pulling one free with a practiced twist to dispatch an elk or an intruder without a sound. Their traps, though simple, were perhaps the most ingenious of all. A length of braided rawhide, looped between saplings bent low under snow, could spring up and bind an ankle, so swiftly a man would pitch forward face first into a drift before he could draw breath to scream. Pitfalls lined with stakes, artfully concealed beneath a crust of fresh snow, could swallow a man whole in the hush of a single step. Even the Norse, who laid siege to stone walls and stormed river forts, could not guard their flanks against a hole hidden under last night's snowfall. Some weapons were not weapons at all, not in the way a Norseman would reckon. Strange bone charms, small bundles of crow feathers bound with sinew, scraps of red-dyed fur knotted around a shard of antler. These were left behind in the tracks of a vanished patrol or hanging from a branch over a dead Viking's camp. To the watchers, they were signs, messages to their kin that a strike had been made, that an enemy had been turned back. But to the Norse, they were curses, physical tokens of an unseen terror. Hardened raiders who laughed at Christian priests clutching crosses found themselves crossing their own chests at the sight of these tokens. Iron and courage were no match for a fear that grew inside the mind, like rot in a timber beam. Even clothing was part of this silent arsenal. A Biamian's hunting tunic was layered fur and soft leather, the outermost skin, often white or grey, not for warmth alone, but for camouflage. In snow-swept woods, a man in a white wolfskin cloak could crouch in a drift and watch a Viking patrol pass 3 strides away, every axe and spear shining bright in the cold sun, and never raise his bow until the last man turned his back. Archaeologists, centuries later, would find only hints of this ghostly war. A single iron blade buried deep in the layers of permafrost, too small to have been Norse. The charred remnants of a bent arrow lodged in a tree ring that dated to an age when longships prowled these coasts. A snowshoe frame of birch lashed tight with rawhide, its wide oval shape matching descriptions passed down in Arab travelogues of the far north. What made these weapons truly terrible was not the steel or the sinew, but the patience behind them. The Biamians did not strike to display power, they struck to unmake it. They would not face 30 Vikings head-on. They would wait 3 nights to silence a single sentry. They would not lay siege to a camp palisade. They would cut the supply lines that fed it until hunger and cold did the killing for them. One tale, scratched into the margin of an old saga, tells of a Norse party that built a ring of stout timber defences around their winter camp, convinced they would root out a Biamian trading post. The watchers did not attack. They crept in at night and stole every spare boot and fur cloak left drying outside the huts. Within 2 weeks, frostbite did more damage than any blade. Of the 30 who came north, only 7 stumbled back, wrapped in rags and the raw hide of their own slaughtered pack ponies. So it was that the Watchers taught the Vikings a truth they had never known on open seas and foreign coasts, that the deadliest edge is not always iron, but silence sharpened by patience, loosed like an arrow through a forest that never sleeps. If the Vikings were masters of the sudden blow, the midnight landing of a longship, the clash of axe and shield before dawn, then the Biamians perfected the art of the blow that never came. Their way of war was not to meet force with force, but to turn the very notion of battle inside out, until their enemies found themselves fighting shadows and snowdrifts instead of flesh and blood. When a Viking warband pushed into the White Forest, they brought the tools they trusted: iron blades, round shields, stout hearts, hardened by raids from Dublin to Kiev. They built rough palisades around their camps, posted sentries at all hours, laid traps for any who might creep in by night. But each of these measures assumed an enemy who would come in the way Vikings themselves attacked, directly, brazenly, seeking honour in the clash of steel. The Watchers had no interest in such a contest. Their tactics were born of the forest's cold logic fight: only when you cannot be seen, strike only when your target is weakest, and vanish before iron ever gleams in moonlight. A typical Viking expedition might start with confidence. They would cut narrow paths through the deep pine, leaving the longships frozen in the fjord's mouth, expecting to return laden with furs and stories of tribute, forced from the forest folk. At first, the silence of the woods seemed a gift. No enemies, no resistance, only the distant call of crows and the hiss of snow under boot. Then came the first sign that something watched: a sentry gone missing, a set of footprints approaching the camp perimeter, but none leaving. Strange spirals of twigs or bones arranged near the fire pit, never there the night before. Alarms spread like frost. Sentries doubled, then tripled. Fires stoked high to push back the dark, which only made the forest beyond the flames look deeper, more endless. Men huddled close together under thick hides, speaking in low voices so as not to draw whatever eyes lay just beyond the ring of firelight. This was the first blow, fear planted like a seed. The next came days later, a hunting party of 3 Norsemen sent to find game they never returned. When their comrades tracked the fresh snow to search for them, they found only a single dropped spear and a smear of red, half covered by drifting flakes. No tracks led onward, as if the men had stepped into the trees and been swallowed whole. Still, the Vikings were stubborn. They tried to force the fight to draw the enemy into the open, where Norse steel could speak. They sent small patrols ahead as bait, hoping to lure the Watchers into an ambush. The Watchers never came. Instead, the patrols returned to camp, colder, hungrier, and with fewer men than they set out with. The Biamians chose their ground with the patience of hunters who knew that time, not courage, decides the kill. They laid false trails, faint footprints that led Norse bands deeper into marshes hidden under snow, where the ice cracked under mailed boots and sucked whole men into black water. They looped back on their own tracks, moving like foxes, doubling through brush to lose the hounds. When they did strike, it was not with a charge, but a whisper. A single arrow from a hidden perch, loosed in perfect silence. A knife between the shoulders of a lone man who wandered too far to piss behind a tree. Always quick, always clean, and always vanishing into the hush of the forest before the alarm could be raised. One old tale tells of the ambush of White Hollow when a Norse band of 40 men found themselves surrounded not by warriors in a line, but by nothing at all, just snow, trees, and the sudden hiss of arrows slipping through the branches at dusk. They formed a shield wall, bracing for a charge that never came. All night they stood, eyes wide, breath steaming. By dawn, 5 men had fallen to arrows fired from nowhere, their shapes outlined in the snow where they fell. The rest abandoned the hollow at sunrise, the watchers drifting after them at the edge of vision like ghosts made of frost. Perhaps the most demoralizing tactic was the feign and fade, an ancient trick known to woodland hunters, but turned into an art against the Vikings. A single figure would appear ahead on a trail, white-cloaked, half hidden behind a pine trunk. A glimpse, no more. A careless step onto a brittle branch, a flash of fur that looked like the trailing edge of a cloak. The Norse, burning with the need to strike back, would give chase. They would stumble deeper and deeper into the maze of the forest's heart, until night fell, the storm came, and they realized too late that they had traded solid ground for the Watcher's world. Sometimes they left the signs of this trap behind, a snapped branch here, a bit of bright cloth snagged on a thorn. But just as often the path ended abruptly, no footprints ahead, no prey to catch. Only snow falling in great, soft curtains, until the men realized the forest behind them had closed like a gate. One Viking skald captured this terror best when he carved into a stave that survived to this day. They fight as if they are snow and wind when we strike. They are not there. When we sleep, they are behind our eyes. In time, some Viking bands learned this lesson too late. Many turned back before spring ever broke the forest's grip, trudging south with half their numbers gone, frostbitten and starved. They carried little to show for their venture, no furs, no tribute, only the shame of having been driven off by enemies they never saw clearly enough to curse by name. For the Biamians, each vanished warband was proof of what they knew from birth. The forest could not be conquered by iron alone. To fight within its bounds was to play by its rules, and its rules were written, not in blood and glory, but in silence and snowdrifts that buried even the mightiest longship tracks, until spring melted all into memory. In the dark hush of Biamians' endless winter, one name echoes in Norse tales like a ghostly warning. Olaf Tryggvason's patrol, 30 seasoned men who vanished into the white forest and returned as a rumour, carried home by the few who staggered back, broken by something they could never quite name. The year was around 995 CE. Olaf Tryggvason, already famed for raids across the British Isles and the Baltic, turned his hungry eyes north. Silver and furs, that was the prize. Stories drifted south of Biamians, trading sable and reindeer pelts so thick they fetched their weight in silver from Frankish merchants. Olaf, ever bold, saw no reason why these shy forest dwellers should keep their wealth when Norse axes could claim it faster than any barter. His plan was simple, in the way only the ambitious could dream it to be. He chose 30 men, not green boys fresh from their fathers' farms, but warriors seasoned by foreign blood. They landed at a fjord's frozen mouth, drew their longship onto a rocky beach, and set out on foot, axes strapped to their backs, bows slung alongside shields painted with snarling beasts. They laughed at the wind. They sang songs to drown the hush of the pines. At first, the forest mocked them with emptiness. The scouts found no tracks, no lodges, no herds. Only frozen rivers locked under feet of ice, snow so deep that each step sank them to the knee. Olaf's men pressed on, hacking rough trails through pine saplings that snapped and fell with sharp cracks that echoed in the silent dusk. On the second day, they found the first sign not of people, but of watchers. A ring of stones in a clearing, carefully placed, almost artful. At the centre lay the skull of a reindeer, bleached white as the snow, its antlers wound with red-dyed sinew that fluttered in the breeze like a blood banner. Olaf's second-in-command, Ivar Sviensen, spat on it and kicked the stones aside. Witchcraft, he scoffed. Let them come out and face iron like men. They marched deeper. Each night they built their fires high, ringed their camp with sharpened stakes, posted sentries 2 at a time. Olaf barked orders with the certainty of a man who had never once retreated from any shore. Yet each dawn, new tracks circled the camp narrow, soft-edged in the powder, snowshoe marks, always just out of bow range. On the 4th day, the snow fell so thick they could barely see the man 10 paces ahead. They marched single file, shields strapped to their backs to free their hands for axes and branches. The forest seemed to press closer, with each mile boughs drooping under fresh snow, muffling every word, every footstep. Then the first man vanished. His name was Thorstein the Bold, young but hardened by raids along the Saxon coast. One moment he was there at the end of the line, glancing back over his shoulder as the snow drifted down, his axe tapping against his thigh. The next, he was simply gone. No shout, no clash. Only the faint echo of something moving fast through the trees, and then nothing. They found the drag mark, faint as a whisper, a line through the snow where a body had been pulled under drooping branches. They followed it for 100 paces, then the trail ended at a frozen creek, its glassy surface unbroken, no blood, no Thorstein. Panic flickered in the men's eyes. Olaf growled it down. Superstitions! One man lost does not turn wolves into spirits. Form up, shields high. We press on. But the forest was listening. That night, the wind rose. Sentries swore they heard faint footfalls circling just beyond the ring of flickering firelight too soft to place. Now and then, an owl called, sharp and close. Once, a spear flew from the dark, thudding into the log where Olaf sat sharpening his blade. He sprang to his feet, roaring a challenge, but no answer came, only the sigh of wind in the pine tops. On the 6th night, the snow stopped. Stars glimmered cold and sharp through gaps in the trees. Olaf's men slept uneasy, axes within arm's reach. Somewhere near dawn, a scream broke, the hush strangled, cut short. By the time the warriors gathered at the camp's edge, there was nothing but a single pool of dark blood, steaming faintly in the brittle air. They tried to hunt the shadows that night. Olaf divided them into pairs, torches blazing as they combed the trees. All they found were old footprints that vanished under fresh drifts, broken branches that led in loops back to the clearing, as if mocking them with their own fear. By the 8th dawn, the patrol was broken. They argued in tight knots by the dying fire. Ivar Sviensen spat curses, claiming witchcraft. Some swore they saw shapes moving in the night, pale cloaks drifting like mist between the trunks. 2 men slipped away on their own, hoping to reach the longship by the fjord's mouth. Their tracks were found days later, trailing off into a drift that ended in a hollow where a low ring of bones had been laid out like a frozen crown. Olaf, furious, gathered the survivors. "Back to the ship," he said. "We leave this place to its ghosts. The forest can keep its secrets. We'll take our silver elsewhere." But Biamians was not done with him yet. The last night before they reached the fjord, a storm rose from the north, cutting wind, drifts piling high, burying the broken trail they had made inward. The men huddled in a shallow hollow under a bent pine. The wind howled, tearing at their cloaks, and beneath that howl they heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps above the wind's wail, a flicker of white among the dark trunks. Then another, and another. No charge came, no shower of arrows. Only the watchers, drifting just out of reach, their presence as suffocating as the snow that smothered the campfire before dawn. Of Olaf's 39, stumbled back to their longship frostbitten, half-starved, eyes sunken from watching the trees too long for shapes that might not even have been there. They left behind axes and shields to lighten their burden. They left behind the bones of their comrades, taken not by spear or sword, but by something older, quieter, a way of war that left no victory songs, only the hush of pines reclaiming the fallen. When Olaf returned south, he never spoke of the patrol, but others did. They called it Olaf's Lost Patrol, the first true clash between the fearless sea wolves and the watchers of the White Forest. A lesson carved not in runes, but in silence. Long after Olaf's Lost Patrol faded into a caution, whispered in longhouses, and traded from mouth to mouth along the fjords, the legend of the Biamians deepened into something colder, a mystery that no blade could cleave and no saga could fully explain. For the forest folk were not just skilled hunters or cunning trackers. To the Norse mind, they were cloaked not only in snow, but in something older, something that blurred the line between man and spirit. The harsh land they called home forged this illusion, but the Biamians themselves fed it, wove it into their ways like a second skin. To outsiders, their winter garb alone could unsettle the stoutest heart. While Norse raiders wrapped themselves in heavy furs layered over mail, the watchers wore robes of white reindeer hide, stitched with bone needles and sealed with fish oil against the wet cold. The fur was selected not for its warmth alone, but for its camouflage. Pale on the outside to blend with drift and branch, dark on the inside to trap the body's heat and mask the shape of a man. Their cloaks were often trimmed in bits of fox or ermine, fine hairs that caught stray snowflakes and broke up outlines at distance. Many sewed tiny bone discs and owl feathers into seams, so that when they moved, the slightest brush of fur on branch made no sound that a man's ear could catch. Some cloaks were more than camouflage. Stories told of elders, forest shamans, who stitched charms into their garments. Carved bits of antler or raven bone dyed red and black. The Norse, who had seen enough sorcery among their own seers to respect the power of runes, found these garments troubling. When a warrior glimpsed a pale figure moving between snow-laden pines, trailing strips of fur that fluttered like wings, it was easy to believe he saw not a man but something half beast, half shadow. Equally strange were the masks, rarely worn in trade parley, but glimpsed by scouts before dawn raids. They were simple things, a strip of hide cut to cover the upper face, holes for the eyes, sometimes painted with ash or ochre in rings that gave the illusion of wide animal pupils. Such masks were practical. They protected frost-bitten skin from wind and hid the human warmth of a face that might otherwise glint with sweat or breath. But they also made the watchers seem less than human, a thing that stared back from the drift and then melted into the trees when the Norse came too close. These tactics did more than hide them. They turned the Vikings' minds against themselves. A man in iron mail might fancy himself fearless in the din of battle, but alone in the hush of endless white. Even the boldest axeman felt his courage crack when the forest offered glimpses instead of foes. A pale shape here, an owl's sudden call there, a single arrow that vanished into a shield, with no sign of who loosed it. One tale survives from a sagaman named Asgrim Skaldson, who wintered in Finnmark with a Norse trader band around 980 CE. He claimed he saw a watcher up close, not in battle, but at the edge of camp during a midnight snowstorm. Asgrim had wandered to relieve himself, muttering at the cold. At the tree line, he glimpsed what he first thought was a birch trunk, but it moved. Slowly, steadily, the shape resolved into a man in white furs, head covered in a hood edged with owl feathers, a mask hiding the eyes but for narrow slits that caught the moon's glow. Asgrim, who had once bellowed curses at Irish monks while swinging an axe, froze with terror as the figure raised a hand, not in threat, but in a gesture that made no sense. A finger pressed where the mouth should be. Silence. Then the figure turned, glided into the trees, and was gone. No sound but the soft hiss of falling snow. Asgrim never forgot that moment, nor the tracks he found come dawn wide oval snowshoe prints that circled the camp twice, as if the watcher had chosen to be seen only because it suited some purpose the Norse could not guess. Such moments fed the stories that grew around the Biamians, like hoarfrost on pine needles. In the longhouses, skalds spun the tale further. They said the watchers spoke with the forest spirits, with the Huldafolk, the hidden people, the Norse themselves, half feared, half worshipped. They claimed the white furs were more than camouflage, that they were charms of the reindeer spirit, making the hunter part of the herd, unseen by blade or wolf or man. Not all the tales were superstition. Modern finds scraps of hide masks, bone amulets, bits of painted sinew show that the watchers used these things practically, but also symbolically. For a people who moved through a land that could kill the careless in hours, blending with nature was not only a hunting skill, but a prayer. To be one with the snow was to survive. But for the Norse, who carved dragons on their prows and wore iron rings to bind oaths and men alike, such fluidity was unnerving. Vikings conquered with hard edges, ships, swords, shields, things that could be seen and counted, weighed in silver and blood. The watchers offered no such reckoning. They were glimpses and footprints and shadows that scattered before an axe could fall. This cloak of snow and spirit was no accident. It was a cultural choice as sharp as any sword edge. The Biamians knew that an enemy who could never pin you down could never truly claim your land. To fight was not to stand in ranks, but to become the forest's echo, to watch the watchful and melt away when the spearhead turned your way. And so they endured. Their pale cloaks and silent masks drifted through Norse fears long after the last raid turned back south. Around hearthfires in Trondheim or Bergen, old men would hush young braggarts with a single tale. Brave your longship where you will, but when you see a shape in the snow that wears the wind for a cloak, turn back. For the forest watches, even when you do not. A Viking's life was a dance with fear. Fear of storms that could swallow a ship whole. Fear of betrayal in a chieftain's hall. Fear of the hidden blade in the dark. Yet they wrapped that fear in steel and saga, they gave it shape. Something to face with sword and shield. But in the white forests of Biamians, fear slipped its leash. It turned wordless. It became a presence that moved through pine shadows on nights when the aurora flared like a ghost fire overhead. When the first raiders stumbled home from the edge of that frozen world, their stories spread like frost creeping over a doorpost at dawn. They spoke not only of vanished sentries or arrows loosed from nowhere, but of signs that made no sense. Spirals of stone, bones arranged in runes no skald could read, strange whispering sounds at the edge of sleep. The Biamians themselves were rarely seen clearly enough to become flesh in these tales. Instead, they blurred into the vastness of their land until fear and folklore stitched them into something more than human. Among the fjords and valleys of the Norse heartlands, the stories shifted. What began as tales of cunning forest hunters became warnings whispered to restless children. Mind the snowdrifts at night, or the watchers will find you. Old women stirring cauldrons would mutter that the Biamians could slip inside the skin of wolves or owls. Some swore that when the wind hissed through pine boughs in midwinter, it was not the wind at all, but the voices of the watchers, calling to each other through the forest's bones. Such tales found a ready home in Norse, minds already crowded with trolls, droga, hulderfolk, and spirits that lurked in rock and water. Vikings were not strangers to the notion that the wild places hid eyes older than men. But where trolls and ghosts were part of their own world beings that could be warded off with iron, with runes, with sacrifice, the watchers were different. They did not live in caves or ancient burial mounds. They moved, breathed, laughed softly at the edge of sight, all while being terribly, hauntingly human. This thin boundary between flesh and spirit fed the worst fear of all, that the forest did not merely hide the Biamians, it made them, that the very snow and wind and whispering trees were kin to them, favouring them over the intruders who dragged iron through a land that wanted none of it. In old Icelandic fragments, half remembered from skalds, whose verses were never fully written down, there is mention of a northern clan whose shamans could vanish by wearing the owl's breath. Some scholars believe this was not literal magic, but a memory of the watcher's skill, the hoods and furs trimmed with owl feathers that made them fade into the forest's hush. But to a Norse mind primed by centuries of belief in shapeshifters and spirit walkers, the line between trick and true witchcraft was thin as new ice. The fear deepened with every failed expedition north. Warriors returned, claiming they had glimpsed pale shapes moving under the aurora, too tall for wolves, too silent for men. Some swore they saw eyes shining in the dark where no fire burned. A few even claimed to hear the laughter of women drifting through the trees just before a spear found its mark in the throat of a sentry. Back in the settlements, the tales grew teeth. In Bergen and Trondheim, children played games in which one played the watcher silent, creeping through a circle of others, pretending to be Norsemen, tapping them one by one until only the watcher remained. In winter, traders passing north left small offerings at the forest's edge, a handful of salt, a twist of wool, a tiny iron knife tokens to buy safe passage, or at least indifference from whatever moved in the snow. Archaeologists have found curious echoes of this terror preserved in unlikely places. Norse charms buried near the northernmost farmsteads' runes, scratched onto bone and driftwood, marked with symbols that do not match the usual talismans against trolls or droga. Some show crude shapes that could be stylized snowshoes, or the branching antlers of reindeer, simple attempts to ward off beings who seemed part human, part beast. Even the skalds, whose business was turning men into legend, found the watchers difficult to cage in rhyme. Unlike berserkers, kings, or seafaring raiders whose deeds rang with clang of iron, these ghosts in the forest offered no glorious death to boast of, no hoard to display, no trophy to mount above the hall fire. Instead, their legacy was absence, the empty footprints at dawn, the patrol that did not return, the hush that fell whenever talk turned to Biamian. A generation after Olaf's lost patrol, a saga fragment tells of a new king who gathered men to push north again this time, with promises of tribute, not conquest. He offered fine iron knives, beads of amber and glass, precious salt from southern shores. He sent envoys under flags of truce, but the watchers never came. The traders left their gifts tied in bundles to trees at the edge of the white woods. When they returned weeks later, the gifts were gone, no tracks, no sign, only a single stone circle where the tribute had stood, marking the boundary between worlds. And so, the myth held, the Watchers did not yield to force, nor bend to gold. They were a people who walked the border between man and spirit, never fully caught, never fully known. They reminded the Norse, so proud of mastery over sea and sword, that some places cannot be bound by iron, only respected. In time, the tales bled into deeper Norse myth. Some say the frost giants of the Eddas, forever lurking at the edge of Midgard, carry shadows of the Watchers' memory, beings of snow and wind who defy the warmth and fire that men cling to. Even now, when the winter wind howls through Norway's pine forests, some old families, still worn children, stay close to the hearth, for in the snow the eyes of the Watchers never close. By the time word of Olaf's lost patrol and other vanished raiding bands trickled back to the fjords, a new truth settled over the Norse mind like a winter mist. The Biamians were not just hunters of men's bodies, they were hunters of the mind. If the Vikings shaped fear with axes and fire, the Watchers shaped it with silence, symbols, and a slow unravelling of courage that no sword could parry. For the Norse, every raid was built on a simple equation. You came ashore in force, struck fast and hard, shattered your enemy's spirit before they could muster their defence. Panic was your ally. A monastery's wooden door splintering under an axe, smoke and screams rising into dawn as monks fled before iron. The same men who set farmsteads aflame along Irish coasts now found the match turned back on them, except the flame was invisible, burning not wood but nerve. The Biamians knew this long before the first iron prows pushed up their rivers. They understood that the cold itself could be an accomplice, that fear, once seeded, flowered quickest when the nights were long, the mind worn thin by hunger, and the ceaseless whisper of snow against a canvas of endless dark. A Viking warband might arrive north with bold songs on their lips, but days in the forest made the songs shrink to mutters. The men grew quiet, glancing at the pines, as if the branches themselves might lean down to listen. In that hush, the Watchers played their oldest trick, to show just enough presence to keep the intruders awake at night, yet never enough to strike back at. They left runes, not the runes the Norse carved in good iron or bright oak, but spirals of stone, bones bound in patterns that seemed half recognised, yet wrong enough to gnaw at a man's sleep. A single owl feather stuck point down in the snow beside a fire pit. The footprint of a snowshoe just inside the sentry's circle, pointing inward. Small things, yet each one a message. We see you. We choose when to come. They chose their moments with a hunter's patience. A Viking who fell asleep at his post might wake to find a rough leather cord tied gently around his boot. No harm done, but the lesson clear as an arrow to the throat. If we wished you dead, you would be. At times, they struck to kill a swift arrow from behind a pine, a knife thrust in the dark. But often, they simply took. Food stores vanished overnight. Sled ponies cut loose, so the raiders must slog home knee-deep in drifts. Once, a returning band found their longship pushed half-frozen into the fjord's shallows, the prow sunk under fresh ice. No sign of footprints, only the raw puzzle of how many pale figures it would have taken to slide a vessel so far out before the sea swallowed it back. To the Vikings, whose greatest strength was their trust in each other's courage, this silent unmaking of nerve did more damage than open battle ever could. The shield wall was no use here. The axe could not cleave a whisper. Suspicion bred among men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder on foreign shores. Some began to think the forest itself turned brother against brother, that perhaps a man who wandered too far from the fire might come back changed, carrying the Watcher's secrets under his cloak. Modern scholars who piece these stories together sometimes call it primitive guerrilla warfare. But that phrase does not capture the marrow-deep dread this quiet war carved into the Norse heart. The Watchers did not fight for territory alone. They fought to make every tree and snowdrift a reminder that here, the forest's mind was older and more patient than any man's pride. It worked. Over years, petty kings who once dreamed of driving tribute from the north began to weigh the cost. The profit in sable and walrus ivory did not balance the hunger, frostbite, and the eyes that watched from between snow-bowed boughs. Some turned to fragile trade, sending small caravans under the white flag of barter. But even these bands knew better than to linger. A few days at the edge of Biamians' realm, never deep enough for the shadows to close behind them. For the Biamians, there was power in restraint. They understood what the Norse did not, that sometimes the greatest strike is the one left undone. A dead warrior might be mourned and avenged, but a man who returned home alive, yet haunted by sleepless nights and glimpses of pale shapes, half seen in the drifting snow, that man carried the Watcher's legend into every hearth and longhouse. He was their unwitting herald, spreading fear far beyond the reach of bow or spear. One fragment of a winter poem, scratched into an Icelandic saga nearly 2 centuries later, preserves this dread in a single line. They slip behind the eye's last blink. What blade can find a ghost that never stands still? The Watchers did not need shields. They needed only patience, silence, and the simple truth that a man will break himself against his own mind long before the forest breaks him. And so the war was won, not with slaughter, but with a hush that turned iron dull and left proud raiders whispering in the dark, asking themselves not when the strike would come, but whether it already had. Long before the snow cloaked their footprints, and the Norse called them spirits of the pines, the Biamians shaped their greatest weapon in the hush of family hearths and the frost-bound clearings deep inside the white forest. This weapon was not iron or bowstring. Alone, it was a school of silence, an inheritance of knowledge taught not by parchment, but by blood and breath, and the careful watching of elders, whose eyes missed nothing. The Norse, for all their sagas of berserkers and shield walls, trained their young for open battle to hold a line, to swing an axe shoulder to shoulder with kin. But in Biamiand, a boy or girl learned early that to survive in a land where the cold itself could kill more surely than any spear, mastery was not about force. It was about slipping through the world unnoticed and shaping it in your favour when no one saw your hands at work. They began young. A child was barely walking before they were shown how to move through snow without leaving a clear trail. Small feet wrapped in reindeer hide, tested on drifts under an elder's watchful gaze. If the print was too deep, the lesson was repeated: step lighter, spread your weight, use the wind that sweeps your passage clean behind you. At 5 or 6 winters, the child learned the forest's alphabet, the signs left by elk and fox, the trail of a marten whose fur might fetch iron blades from southern traders. They learned that every snap of a twig was a word that could give them away, so they learned how to slip past the brittle branches or snap them deliberately to make an enemy look the wrong way. By 10 winters, they were taught how to vanish entirely, not with magic, but with patience. A mother might bury her child chest-deep in a drift, covering them with boughs and snow, then sit a short distance away, watching. Hours passed. The child lay still as a stone, breath slow, eyes fixed on a single patch of sky through the pine needles. Hunger gnawed. The cold seeped through fur and skin. But the lesson was simple. If you could not silence your own shiver, you could not silence your enemy's blade. In these secret schools scattered across family hearths and winter lodges, half buried beneath snow, the greatest teachers were the old hunters. These were men and women who might seem like ghosts themselves, skin leathered by wind, voices soft as falling flakes. Their wisdom was not kept in written runes, but in a map of stories, which stream froze last in autumn, where the snow crust could bear a man's weight without cracking, which trees whispered warnings when the wind shifted. A chosen few, those with sharp eyes, quick hands, and minds that could hold silence like a hidden knife, were taught more dangerous lessons. These were the future ghost hunters, the snowborn, the ones who would stand unseen just beyond the Viking campfire's flicker. They learned the language of the owl and the fox, not the sounds, but the patterns. How an owl's hoot might mask the hiss of an arrow, how a fox's scampering could cover a hunter's footstep when closing the last few paces to an enemy's throat. They learned to craft the curved knives, so prized among the watchers. A boy of 12 might be taken far into the forest with an elder and shown how to select the right stone to whet a blade so thin it could split hide without tearing fur. The same knife could open a man's throat as easily as a reindeer's belly, leaving barely a stain on the snow. Then came the mastery of the bow, a lesson that blended hunter's craft with something like ritual. A bow was not made quickly. It was grown, shaped, cured, layered with sinew, pulled from the hind legs of elk, and sealed with resin and fat. Each stave was named not aloud, but in the mind. For the Biamians believed a weapon that served in silence deserved to be honoured in silence. Tests of this training were quiet, personal, and final. A young hunter might be sent to stalk a lone wolf through the forest, not to kill it, but to follow unseen until he could touch the beast's fur without raising its hackles. If he failed, he risked teeth and claws and scars that would speak for him all his days. If he succeeded, he returned not with trophies, but with a new name, spoken only within his kin circle. These lessons shaped not warriors in the Viking sense, but artists of patience and shadows. Each generation refined the art. They wove the old skills with new tricks, learned from watching the Norse themselves. How a shield was carried, how armour weighed a man down, how firelight betrayed the glint of an iron helm far off among the pines. Their secret schools had no halls of stone. Their teachers left no carved rune stones to mark their knowledge. Yet their graduates stepped softly through the centuries, inheriting and perfecting the single rule that made the White Forest unconquerable. Be the land that others fear to walk. One Arab trader who wintered among them in the late 900s left a fragmentary record, a note in cramped script, speaking of children who disappear among the trees, who appear behind you with knives and laughter when you think you are alone. Centuries later, sagas repeated the same line in simpler words. A Norseman may boast of iron and ships, but a snowborn boasts of nothing. He is the arrow that never speaks. And so the Watchers' schools endured. Invisible academies passed from hand to hand like embers kept alive beneath the snow. When the Norse came with axes and longships, these hidden students answered with traps and patient eyes. When the last raiders limped home to whisper of spirits in the white woods, the Watchers taught their own children what truly mattered. That silence was not only survival, it was victory. Among the sagas carved in memory and bone, few tales haunt the Norse heart like that of the raid that never came, a campaign so certain in its planning, so feared in its imagining, that it fell apart before the first axe left its scabbard. It stands as the clearest testament to the Watcher's quiet victory. Proof that the strongest walls are not built of stone, but of fear that creeps beneath the skin. It began in the longhouse of Jarl Ketil Ravenshield, a petty king whose fame rode on the silver tides of the Baltic and the blood-wet sands of Irish shores. Ketil was no fool. His raids funded new ships, paid loyal Huskarls, and bought him feasts that made his hall the envy of neighbouring chieftains. Yet the more he gave, the more his followers wanted. Each man who bent the knee expected gold and plunder, and so Ketil's eyes turned north. Word had trickled south that the Biamians, elusive though they were, sat atop untapped wealth. Winter-fattened furs, walrus ivory, rare amber dredged from the cold river's beds. Traders who came back alive whispered of seasonal caches hidden in the white woods, stores of skin and bone, and hide that, if seized in a single blow, would make a jarl richer than a lifetime of coastal raids. In the glow of firelight, Ketil laid his plan. No more scattered patrols and blind trudging into the drifts. This time, he would gather 200 men, seasoned warriors, not green boys, and march north with pack horses, sleds, and iron enough to carve a fort into the forest's heart. He would hold it through the winter, force the watchers to kneel, or starve them into trade on Norse terms. For weeks, the plan grew bolder. Shipwrights hammered out new sled runners and reinforced shields. Spears were tipped with iron drawn from distant mines, sharper than anything the forest folk could muster. Ketil's skalds composed verses in advance, predicting the wealth he'd haul south on sledges laden with sable and silver. In the hearth shadows, old men shook their heads. The young scoffed at them. Had not the Norse brought Irish kings to heal? What could a handful of fur-clad shadows do against 200 blades? But among the warriors themselves, rumours spread like an early frost. They knew men who had gone north, or rather, they knew the brothers and cousins of men who never came home. In back rooms and smoke-filled corners, quiet voices told the old stories. The tracks that ended mid-snowfield, the whispers at night, the watchers who left no bodies to bury, only bones arranged like runes that no skald dared carve. Still, Ketil's iron will held. He sent word along the fjords. Every household must provide men or silver to buy supplies. Blacksmiths worked through the nights to shape arrowheads and repair mail shirts rusted by salt spray. Banners were readied not the black raven of raid alone, but a new standard stitched with a white wolf's head to mock the watchers in their own den. Yet, as the muster grew, so did the doubt. Small signs appeared like frost around a hearth fire. A champion's horse found dead at dawn, throat opened cleanly, yet no blood on the snow. An eldest son vanished while checking the sleds at the edge of the pine. A single snowshoe track found circling the supply cache. No break-in, no theft, just a sign to say, "We know." The night before the raiding force was to march, the warriors gathered for a feast, meat roasted over iron spits, horns foamed with mead and ale. The skald sang verses of the spoils to come, furs piled like waves on the sleds, the watchers kneeling in chains before the raven banner. But at the edges of the hall, men drank too quickly, glancing at the dark windows, wondering what might be listening in the wind. One by one, excuses spread like embers in straw. A father claimed he must see his land tilled before the thaw. A brother muttered of an omen. A raven perched backward on his longhouse roof. Huskarls drifted to their bedrolls early, voices low. When dawn cracked cold and brittle, Ketil stepped from his hall to find a force half its promised strength. By noon, the fields and dockyards whispered that fewer still would come. The watchers had not loosed an arrow. They had not slain a champion in the open. Instead, they had slipped through the edges of the village like a rumour with teeth. They had left no clear sign, only the old certainty that in the white forest, iron and bravery did not weigh enough to balance the scales of silence. In the days that followed, Ketil cursed and threatened. He promised to burn farms and seize cattle from families whose sons stayed home. He claimed the gods mocked any man who let fear rule his axe hand. But in the hush behind every oath, the truth stood plain. Fear had done what no blade. Could it had built a wall, the watchers would never need to guard. When spring came, the sleds and spears rotted in their sheds. Traders ventured north instead, one by one, humbly, bearing salt and beads and knives to barter. They did not camp far from the forest's edge. They did not carry shields or hoist banners. They left their goods on stones or hung them in bundles from bent saplings. And when they turned back south days later, they found those same bundles replaced with furs or ivory, no tracks, no greeting, no enemy to strike. In time, Jarl Ketil's plan became a cautionary tale told by skalds with a grin. The raid that never came, the march never marched, the wealth that stayed hidden in the snow. Yet, beneath the jest lingered a sober truth. The Norse had found their match not on open seas or in fortress halls, but in the hush between snowflakes where footsteps fade and iron grows cold in the hand. So the watchers remained unclaimed, unbroken. They needed no fortress walls because they had built an empire of the mind, a dominion of fear that sent the fiercest warriors home before the first arrow ever found its mark. When the last great raid faltered before it ever touched the forest's edge, a different current began to flow between the Norse and the ghostly Biamians. The axe could not open the white woods, but silver might slip through where iron failed. So the fiercest raiders in Europe became, in the frozen north, something they rarely admitted to being elsewhere. Humble traders, careful guests in a realm that refused to kneel. It did not happen all at once. In the wake of failed patrols and vanished men, some petty kings saw ruin, but the clever ones saw opportunity. What they could not take by force, they might secure through quiet trade. Furs thicker than any southern pelt. Walrus ivory so hard and white, it fetched triple the price of common horn. Tiny lumps of amber found in streams under snowdrifts, lumps that Saxon bishops would pay for in silver coins, stamped with crosses and kings' heads. And so, out of fear and profit both, the Norse carved a new bargain with the Watchers. This bargain had no treaty stone, no formal seal. It lived in gestures and caution, in careful rites as old as the first barter between wary strangers. A Viking band would set out from a coastal farmstead with no more than a dozen men, no axes on display, no iron helms gleaming to catch the light between pine trunks. They would carry bundles of salt, bright glass beads, knives shaped for scraping hide gifts as much as goods. They did not march deep into the woods. They stopped where the last line of birch gave way to dense pine. There they built a small fire and stacked their wares on flat stones, arranged in neat piles, as if to say, "We come with open hands, not hungry blades." Then they waited. Hours, sometimes days. Nights passed with the hiss of snow drifting against cloak and pack. In the dark, they heard the forest's old music, the distant crack of branches, the hush of snowfall on pine needles. Somewhere out there, eyes watched. Shapes might flicker at the edge of the campfire's reach, never close enough for an arrow, never far enough to be forgotten. And then, without word or warning, the trade was done. The Norse would wake to find the stones bare, the salt and beads gone. In their place, neat bundles of sable pelts, rolls of fox and ermine tied with braided sinew, or a small tusk of ivory wrapped in birch bark to protect it from the wet. No thanks was spoken, no oath exchanged. If the Norse lingered too long, if they stepped beyond the unspoken line, They might return to their camp to find only empty snow and the faint spiral of stones, marking where not to come again. In time, the boldest traders learned the quiet signals that kept this exchange alive. A small sprig of pine laid on top of a trade pile meant the watchers would accept more knives next year. An extra bundle tied with red-dyed hair warned that the forest wished no more visitors that season. If these signs were ignored, the forest would remind them. A missing horse, a lone guard who did not wake before dawn. Yet beneath this hush, a strange trust grew. The Norse, for all their ferocity abroad, knew how to respect strength when they found it. Some even marvelled at the Watcher's way of life, how a people could move so freely through a realm that broke lesser men's bodies and minds. Traders came home with stories of distant glimpses, pale figures darting behind snow-bowed trees, children on wide skis, gliding like ghosts over frozen lakes. They spoke of huts half buried in drifts that rose like earth mounds when spring came, then vanished again with the first snows. The trade routes that flickered into being were not roads, but veins of trust that pulsed in rhythm with the seasons. When the rivers thawed, some watchers slipped south in secret bands, not to raid, but to barter on their own terms. They arrived at remote Norse outposts, with sleds laden in silence, exchanging furs for salt and iron, then disappearing before the locals could boast too loudly about having met the forest's children face to face. A few stories speak of deeper ties, Norse traders who took Biamian wives, or children born on the boundary between two worlds. These sons and daughters grew up speaking both the roar of the longhouse and the hush of the pine grove. They carried knives and snowshoes alike, learning to bow low before a jarl's silver, yet vanish into the woods when pride turned to greed. But the watchers were not easily swallowed by Norse hunger for dominion. Each generation measured the trade against the risk. When Norse lords grew too bold, sending larger bands into the White Realm, the old lessons returned swiftly, a patrol gone missing, a sled train lost under a sudden blizzard, guided or misled by shapes half seen on a ridge at dusk. So the Arctic trade dance settled into its uneasy pattern, a cautious step forward, a retreat when the forest silence turned sharp. Norse skalds praised the wealth, but rarely boasted of the bargain behind it. To speak too openly of the watchers was to invite the same hush that haunted Olaf's patrol, and no man who hoped to live long risked that shadow lightly. And so, for generations, the fiercest raiders of the north bent their pride at the forest's edge. They learned that some kingdoms hold no walls but snowdrifts, no crowns but pine needles. They learned that trade could buy what steel could not. And they learned, above all, that in Biamians, every bargain was made not between conqueror and conquered, but between guests and ghosts who never quite stepped into the fire's light. For a generation or two, the fragile dance of barter at the forest's edge held. But in the age of blades and bold kings, there is always one who believes he can break the old pact that fear is but wind, to be scattered by iron and fire. So the Vikings, restless in their hunger, tried one final time to force open the white woods. What followed became a ghost story carved into the bone of Norse memory, the last doomed stand in Biamian's silent heart. The man who dared it was no petty chieftain, but a king in all but name Eric Bloodhand, a raider whose sails had blackened the Irish Sea and whose sword had turned rivals into crow's meat along the Swedish coast. Eric was young still, yet already a legend among his own, quick to smile, quicker to kill, reckless in that way only the most feared men can afford to be. He looked north and saw only untapped silver and a people too few, too quiet, to stand against the hammer he carried in his mind. The watchers had left his first traders well enough alone. They had taken salt, iron knives, beads, and given back furs thick enough to line the cloaks of Jarls from Uppsala to Hedeby. But Eric, drunk on conquest, saw only the trade's hidden promise. If the forest folk could barter so much from the shadows, how much more did they hold back, deep in their drift, lost lairs? He gathered 70 men, picked raiders clad in mail, hardened by winters on open seas. They brought dogs this time, lean brutes bred to sniff out trails. They dragged sleds, laden not with gifts, but with axes, saws to fell the pines, iron spades to break the forest's secret caches. In their minds, they would burn the Watcher's world down to its roots and return south with sledges piled high and legends to shame every other Jarl's boast. They vanished into Biamians in late autumn, when the rivers first began to lock in brittle ice and the sun's climb was little more than a pale arc across the midday sky. For days there was no sign of trouble. Their dogs picked up faint scents old tracks, half-covered camps, trails where sleds had once cut across frozen bogs. Here and there they found the ghostly mark of snowshoes pressed into older drifts, pointing deeper toward the forest's frozen heart. They made camp in a shallow valley ringed by ancient spruce. Fires hissed against the snow as men laughed and sharpened blades. Eric paced the camp's edge, staring at the dark gap between the trees, where the watchers, he was sure, hid like wolves too cowardly to bare their teeth. The first arrow came at dusk on the third day, a hiss through the branches, a choked gasp, and one of the dogs lay dead, its flank pierced clean through. No shape moved in the trees. The men shouted, shields up, eyes wide. They waited for a charge that never came. The next night, 2 men posted at the camp's north edge failed to answer the dawn call. Their footprints ended at the tree line. No blood, no struggle, just an empty hush, thick with falling snow. Eric cursed and spat into the drift, ordering patrols deeper into the trees. The patrols returned with nothing but glimpses, a flicker of white hide, a whisper of laughter carried on the wind. The dogs, so fierce at home, now cringed and whined at the leash, noses lifting to scents they could not follow. As days turned to weeks, the raiders began to realize the forest itself was changing around them. Drifts piled higher each night, burying the crude palisade of logs they'd built around their firing. Trails laid one day, vanished, the next under fresh powder. Traps they'd set for elk came up empty, yet in the darkness they heard herds moving, felt the hush of hooves on snow they could not cross. Each dawn brought small torments. Their stores of dried fish and barley dwindled, the sleds lightening while their own bodies grew heavier with hunger. Sometimes they found their own sled trails, crossed by fresh tracks, snowshoe prints that circled the camp, spirals and runes pressed into the drift like a hand pressed to a throat. Eric raged, but each night another man vanished into the hush. Some fought back with iron. A pair of scouts caught a pale figure at the camp's fringe. A boy, no more than 14 winters by his height. They dragged him before Eric in the fire's spit and hiss. But when they tore back the boy's hood, they found only an empty cloak wrapped around a bundle of furze bait to draw them into the snow. By the time they looked up, the tree line was alive, with faint shapes slipping away, as silent as breath on the frost. In the end, the snow did what the watchers did not have to. Hunger gnawed. The men burned their sleds for firewood, stripped their own furs for scraps. Frost cracked mail and leather into splinters. One morning, the men woke to find the dogs gone, their tethers cut, paw prints drifting away into the dark where no Viking dared follow. By midwinter, what was left of Eric's force staggered south. Fewer than 20 gaunt figures, eyes ringed with frostbite, mouths cracked open from the cold. They left behind no fort, no victory songs, no sleds piled with silver and fur. The white woods closed behind them, drift by drift, branch by branch. Some say Eric himself never made it home. He vanished into a storm when the column broke near the fjord's mouth. A pale shape glimpsed walking ahead, always just out of reach, until he stepped into the snow's swirl and was gone forever. Those who survived never spoke of glory. They spoke instead of eyes glimpsed at night, of songs half heard through the wind, voices that sounded almost human, drifting above the pines like smoke from a hidden hearth. So the last stand of Norse iron in the white forest ended not in battle, but in a silence more complete than any shield wall could muster. The watchers did not claim trophies. They did not hang heads from pines or wear enemy helms as prizes. They let the forest tell the story, a hush in the branches, a drift where footprints fade, a memory that sent the next generation of Jarls south instead of north when hunger for silver rose with the spring thaw. And Biamians endured, untouched, undefeated, bound not by walls, but by the certainty that sometimes victory leaves no bodies, only the snow closing over another tale of men who thought the world could be mastered, and learned instead that the world sometimes chooses to remain hidden. When Eric Bloodhand's final stand dissolved into snow and hunger, the Norse turned south once more, toward rivers they could sail, coasts they could plunder, kings they could threaten with blades and fire. The white forest, so alive with hidden eyes, was left behind like a half-remembered nightmare that men carried in old scars and quiet stories told around smoky hearths. But the watchers did not vanish when the Norse stopped looking for them. They slipped deeper into the woods and marshes, melting like mist between pine trunks, older than any Viking longhouse. If you could stand on a frozen ridge and look down through time, you would see them, families moving like shadows along ancient reindeer trails, building winter lodges half buried under drifts, birchbark sleds gliding across frozen lakes, where the sky dances green and white above a silence so complete it becomes a kind of hymn. No rune stones mark their empire, no carved records, no hoarded silver, no iron blades laid reverently in burial mounds. Their legacy was never one of monuments but of memory, stories woven not into parchment but into the marrow of those who came after. When the Norse age dimmed and new kingdoms rose, traders and travellers still told of figures glimpsed far to the north, cloaked in white, drifting through storms like the spirits their ancestors had once feared. Historians looking back see this quiet endurance in small signs. A fragment of reindeer hide stitched with sinew, unearthed beneath a layer of tundra peat. A ski half buried in ancient ice, shaped perfectly for speed over deep drifts, bone arrowheads, tiny and light, found in places no Norse settlement ever reached. Each piece is a whisper, a proof that while longships rotted on southern shores, the watcher's way of life threaded on like a breath held between seasons. The forest did not remain untouched forever. Over centuries, the borders shifted. Sami herders, kin and cousins to those same watchers, ranged wide with reindeer herds, blending old pathways with new trades. Some mingled with Norse settlers on the fringes, teaching how to read the drift story, how to mend fur boots with fish sinew, how to make a fire vanish before the dawn so no stranger might follow its trail. In these meetings, pieces of the old craft survived, like embers banked under snow. Norse traders adopted skis for hunting in deep snows. They learned to weave sled harnesses light enough to float on ice. Legends of skinwalkers and forest spirits drifted south with the reindeer pelts slowly transforming into folklore that tangled with older fears of trolls and frost giants. The Watchers themselves changed too. They did not remain frozen in the age of Olaf's patrol. They drifted with the centuries, folded into the ever-shifting story of the Arctic's true children. Some became full-time traders, guiding Norse or Karelian caravans through secret passes known only to those born under the Northern Lights. Others retreated deeper still, keeping the old ways alive in places where no map's edge dared name a boundary. For the Vikings, the Watchers became part of a larger truth, that the world could never be fully tamed. They were a reminder that even the fiercest prow could not part every sea, that some kingdoms lie hidden, not in stone walls, but in the hush between snowflakes and the eyes that watch unseen. By the time the last Viking jarls bowed to Christian kings, and their sons put aside axes for trade and farming, the old stories lingered like frost on the tongue. In the western fjords, farmers muttered of ghost hunters who could slip through storms unseen. Fishermen offered small gifts to the trees at the edge of the forest, a twist of wool, a bit of salt, just in case the Watchers still walked the drifts when the wind howled wrong. Sometimes a lost traveller stumbled half dead into a Sami camp and told of eyes in the trees that guided him through the storm, or of a pale figure on skis gliding ahead at dusk, showing the path back to the river's mouth before vanishing, as if the forest swallowed him whole. Modern scholars debate what was real and what was fear given shape by firelight and winter's hush. But to the old lineages of the north, the reindeer herders, the trappers who set silent snares where snow lies deep, there is little question. The Watchers were real, and they remain real in spirit wherever the drift closes over a trail and the pine boughs lean down to listen. Today, long after the Norse longships fell to rot and rust, the knowledge that once turned snow into fortress still breathes in Arctic peoples who carry reindeer bones in their sled runners, who tie fox fur at the hem of a hood so the frost does not bite too deep, who know how to listen for the silence that says, "You are being seen." Their legacy is not a monument you can stand before. It is the hush under the trees when the wind drops. It is the fleeting mark of a snowshoe across a frozen lake that no storm can hold forever. It is the quiet certainty that in this world, for all the iron and fire men carry, there remain places that choose who may enter and who will vanish without a cry. So the Watchers live on, not in the sagas of raiders or the boasts of kings, but in the stories murmured when the lamps burn low and the winter snow presses close against the longhouse wall. A people without walls or crowns, and yet in the hush of the white forest, undefeated still. Long after the last Watcher's snowshoe trail faded under fresh drifts, their shadow lingered woven not into maps or charters, but into the Norse imagination itself. For when the Vikings turned back from the white forest, they did not return empty-handed. They carried home tales that bled into myth, shaping how the Norse understood the wild edge of their world. It began in whispers, skalds repeating fragments, brought back by half-frozen survivors, of pale shapes glimpsed beneath the aurora, of eyes in the pine dark that saw without being seen. These stories mingled with older fears, older beliefs, that the forests were alive with beings both flesh and spirit. And so the Watchers blurred into the vast realm of Norse myth, a place already crowded with trolls, Jotnar, and the Hulderfolk, the hidden people who slipped between this world and the next. Some skalds spoke of them as Skogsvatir forest wights, the same name given to the lesser spirits said to guard groves and ancient trees. But unlike tame household spirits or river sprites, these wights carried blades and left runes in the snow. They were both human and more than human people who might be flesh one moment, drifting ghost the next. To the Norse mind, this was not contradiction, but proof that the world was deeper than the reach of any axe. In the Eddas, frost giants stalked the edges of Midgard, embodiments of wildness that no god or man could truly tame. To a Viking who came back from Biamians with frostbite gnawing his toes, the Watchers were frost giants, not in size, but in spirit, unknowable, part of the land's oldest marrow, older than any Jarl's claim, older than even Odin's runes carved into Yggdrasil's bark. One fragment from an Icelandic saga, half lost to time but preserved in the scribbled margin of a monk's later text, describes them plainly. They are neither troll nor man, but drift like snow between worlds, and when they wish, they make men lose themselves so they may walk the paths alone. What was fear in the forest became story in the longhouse, and story hardened into belief. In the high north, some families carved small figurines of white-cloaked hunters, left in doorways to ward off wandering spirits. They spoke quiet charms before entering deep woods in winter, muttering that the Watchers might turn a lost man's feet homeward if he carried no iron in anger and asked nothing but safe passage. Even in the grand myth cycles of the Norse, echoes of the Watchers linger. Some scholars trace the word Hivitvandrare, white wanderers, to sagas describing ghostly figures who led lost travellers through storms, only to vanish when dawn broke. Other legends spun them into the retinue of Ulla, the bow god, patron of skiing and silent hunts through snow. Ulla was never among the loud warrior gods, like Thor, or the sly tricksters like Loki. He belonged to the hush of winter, a place where men hunted alone, trusting skill and silence more than steel. Did the Watchers help shape Ulla's domain in the Norse mind? No runestone says so outright. But it is no accident that in parts of Scandinavia, where the Sami and other Arctic peoples mingled with Norse settlers, Ulra's worship grew strongest. The god who glided on skis and drew a silent bow felt kin to the unseen hunters who moved without sound through drift and pine. Stories of shapeshifters to Hamramir, skin changers gathered the Watchers' ghost-like reputation into Norse folklore. Where did the tales of men who wore wolf skins and moved like beasts under the full moon come from? Some skalds would say from berserkers alone, but others, remembering the white cloaks, the owl feather masks, the sudden flicker of fur in a snowstorm, saw something older. A people who blurred man and beast not through magic alone, but through mastery of the wild places that made them both. Even the Valkyries, death's pale maidens who chose the slain, sometimes borrow the Watcher's breath in older tellings. They appear on battlefields as sudden shapes, eyes shining under helms, then vanish into mist and frost, bearing warriors away to halls where the fires never die. In the oldest songs, they wear cloaks of swan feathers, drift between worlds not so different from the pale figures who moved at the edges of the white forest, choosing who lived, who vanished, and who returned to whisper fear into the longhouses. What is myth, if not memory, carried beyond the reach of fact? The Watchers, who left no fortress, no kingly line, no saga etched in iron, endured by slipping into other skins hidden behind frost giant tails, woven into the god of the bow, echoing in the hush of shapeshifter stories told by firesides when the snow presses hard against timbered walls. And though the age of Viking raiders passed, their legacy clung to these fragments. Even today, where the old north reaches toward the Arctic's edge, stories linger. Sami elders still speak of Stalu monstrous hunters, part spirit, part man, part cautionary tale for children, who stray too far from the reindeer herds in deep winter. Scholars argue whether the Stalu come from the same old fears that birthed the Watchers in Viking minds, or if they are echoes of the Watchers themselves, seen through the lens of generations who learned that sometimes it is safer to name a thing monster than neighbour. So the Watchers remain not as ghost soldiers with axes in hand, but as the hush under myth's crust, the flicker at the pine's edge when the night wind rises. A reminder that the Norse, for all their iron and fire, never truly conquered every frontier. Some lands kept their secrets. Some people learned that the best fortress needs no stone, no crown. Only the silence that makes fear grow roots and branches in the minds of those who dare to come too close. The sagas of the North remember many things. Kings who broke kingdoms on the edge of an axe, ships that carried thunder along iron grey seas, longhouses where gold glimmered in the fire's glow and skalds sang, so no one would forget. But some of the North's deepest truths were whispered, not carved in stone. Some victories left no loot, no monuments, only silence. And in that silence, the Watchers endure. What did they leave behind? Not cities or hordes or high palisades rotting under moss. Their gift is harder to weigh. The reminder that even the fiercest blade breaks where patience and the land conspire. That sometimes the world's truest fortress is the world itself, if only you know how to listen when the snow falls and the forest holds its breath. 1,000 years after Eric Bloodhand's men vanished into drifts that gave back only bones and rumours, the northern forests still stand. The old trails remain ghost lines winding through pine and birch, known only to herders moving reindeer across ridges under skies that shift from deep blue dusk to green aurora's dance. The same skills that shaped the Watchers flicker in these people still, the quiet step, the hunter's patience, the unspoken bargain with the wind and the drift. Historians might look for ruins and find none. They dig and find only scraps. A bone needle, a broken ski, an arrowhead shaped for silence rather than war cries. They wonder, did these people truly stand against the Vikings? Were they spirits or men? The answer lives between the lines of the old sagas, in the eyes of raiders who returned home with frostbitten fingers, and tales they dared not boast too loudly. It lives in the old Sami words for unseen neighbours, watchers in the drift, ghosts who slip between spruce trunks just when the night grows deepest. The Watchers teach us a lesson the Vikings themselves, for all their hard edges, came to grasp too late. That power is not always in iron or fire, but in the quiet mastery of place. The Biamians, the hidden ones, turned the very weapons of the north against the intruders. The snow that swallowed footprints, the wind that covered a scout's scent, the silence that crawled under a warrior's mail shirt and made him see shapes that might not even be there. And more than fear, they taught the old truth that not every fight must be fought head-on. In the Longhouse, glory came in the clash of blade on shield. But in the White Woods, glory lay in the kill not taken, the battle unfought, the path made so treacherous that even the boldest king turned back. The Watchers did not need to spill rivers of blood. A single sentry gone without a sound could send a whole company south again, heads down, songs unsung. When the Norse gave up their last raids northward, they did not speak of defeat. They called it a bargain, a trade, a piece of their own choosing. But the forest knew the truth. No iron wall forced them back, only a hush, so deep it could break an army before the first arrow flew. That hush echoes now in ways we still carry, whether we know it or not. It whispers from Arctic hunters who slip across tundra trails using snowshoes shaped much like those old Watchers wore. It drifts in tales told by reindeer herders when the wind howls wrong and the tracks vanish overnight. Be still, be humble, listen, for there are eyes in these woods older than your fear. It lives too in the stories we pass on without knowing their true source myths, of frost giants lurking where warmth fails, of shapeshifters slipping through drifts in the dark. These are the Watcher's true legacy, not as ghosts to be hunted down, but as reminders that the wild always keeps something for itself, no matter how far we sail or how sharp our axes grow. And so they remain not gone, but vanished in the way drift covers a track, never truly erasing it. You can stand in a winter forest today, breath rising in a hush of pine needles and hoarfrost. And if you listen long enough, you might hear them still. The soft scrape of a snowshoe on frozen crust, the sigh of an arrow passing through empty air, or nothing at all, the greatest sound they left us, the knowledge that sometimes victory is the hush no enemy ever pierces. If the Vikings were the sea's wolves, the Watchers were the forest's breath, patient, silent, enduring beyond the pride of kings or the sagas of schools. In the end, that may be the oldest truth of the North, that for every iron edge a man brings to the wild waits with older edges still drift, wind, silence, and the eyes of those who learned long ago that to be unseen is sometimes the greatest power of all. So listen. The snow falls, the pines creak in the wind, and if you stand very still, if you remember not to boast or bellow, you might catch a glimpse of something pale drifting just beyond your fire's glow. You might feel that old lesson settle in your bones. Some stories never end because the land never truly gives them up. Some ghosts never sleep because the forest never forgets. And in the endless hush of the white forest, the Watchers, though vanished from the maps, stand watch still.